Hey, and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to look at how to hopefully create what might be an ambient occlusion effect to our renderings out of Twinmotion. If you're not aware of this, I believe with the release of 2021, we lost the ability to have actual ambient occlusion just kind of built into our renders and our scenes, which is too bad because a lot of times it looks like furniture and a number of different things are floating on the ground, which is due to the lack of ambient occlusion, which is going to be those softer shadows at the base of things and at the corners of a lot of your ceilings, things like that. So before we get into it, if you happen to learn something, which I'm sure you do, I'm sure you will, please demolish that like button. Really helps me out a lot, quite a lot. Okay, so what are we in now? We're in just a basic Twinmotion project, and I have built this out for the sake of this video so that we can look at this as a rendering. And so right now, it's nice. You know, it's a scene. It's looking through this room onto this lake, whatever. Nice enough. You know, I'm to the point now where I'm ready to click export. And so I'm going to do that first, and then we're going to look at it, and then we're going to kind of diagnose it as far as some of the problems. The main thing it missing will be ambient occlusion, and we're going to spend this video going through something that we can do, kind of multiple steps on how we can make or add ambient occlusion into our final renders. So credit for this video goes to SB Architect, because I did first see him do a video very similar to what we're going to do here. Now, he did not include glass, so it's going to be a bit of a different scene, so it's kind of experimental in that sense, but I'm going to use some of the similar tactics to achieve and end up stacking photos and stacking renders to ultimately get an ambient occlusion effect. So let me first render that image out, and we can look at what we have now to start with, just as a base image. Okay, and here's our base image, our base render. You know, looks pretty good. A few things I do want to point out. If we zoom in here, you know, some of these chairs, like, they look good, obviously good enough because there are shadows, but we're missing some of the extra shadows around here, particularly with some of these sofa chairs and the sofa itself. But you can really see it here when it comes to these tables here in the center. It looks like they're floating. There's no soft shadow here along the edge, and I can't say that we're going to fully guarantee that happening from what we're going to be able to add to this, but that's my hope anyway. And you can also even see some of these pillows just look like they're stamps. You know, they don't really belong in the scene. There's not extra shadow involved, and so hopefully we can achieve something like that in some of these softer shadows to ground some of these objects in our scene. Okay, so here we are. We're back in Twinmotion, and again, I have this one image, and I'm fine with it. I'm really happy with the way it looks as far as the quality, color, whatever you name it. But what I am most concerned about is those ambient occlusions. So let's go ahead and do what we need to do to hopefully add that. So we're going to end up making a couple more images that we're going to end up rendering out of Twinmotion. Take those into Photoshop and then end up stacking them all together in a certain way, and then we can fiddle with them however we want to within Photoshop at that point. But the main thing being that we do want to make sure that we have everything set up in Twinmotion so we can render out all of these and stack them later. Okay, so here's our first image. We're fine with this. Let's now go ahead and duplicate this. Just duplicate it as it is. So we're going to go to our second one, and this is going to be our second image will be our, I guess you could call it our largest ambient occlusion. So there's a big thing that we're going to do here. And so we're immediately going to come into the camera and visual effects and then clay render. So we're going to turn clay render on, and immediately this looks like, you know, hell and blue. So first of all, we don't want this blue. We want this black and white. So if we want straight white, the hex color for white is going to be all F, so 6 Fs. And so there's white. You do and you don't want translucency, and that really depends on your scene. You can see I get a lot of clipping here, and so as I bring this down, I really want to bring it down all the way, just for me. But as I bring it down, I lose that clipping, and you can start to see what we're starting to get. We want more or less a black and white image where we can sort of isolate the shadows, and once we're able to do that, we can then just stack those shadows on top of the base image that we're really happy with. And so the next thing is to get rid of the glass. Obviously, the glass we don't want clay rendered. So here's my multi-selection. I don't want glass. You know, any glass material will no longer be affected, which is fantastic. That's what I want. Okay, so you know we're kind of getting there. I will say here, reflection. While reflection is nice, we don't want extra reflection in this, we want to just really get our shadows, because the shadows are not the reflection, if you will, if that makes sense. Okay, so we look good here. Bump won't really do anything. So back to visual effects. Filters, don't need to worry about that. Color gradient, we're going to probably end up coming back to this quite a lot, but I will start with the saturation. We don't want saturation. We don't need it. So I'll bring that all the way down. So we literally have a black and white image at this point. And so again, I'm going to leave this contrast at 50, but we are going to end up coming back here probably multiple times to just fine tune this. Okay. And so with the reflections here, we can leave those on. It doesn't make a difference because we're within Clay Edit. We've already turned those off. Within camera, everywhere else here, I would turn the vignetting off if you have any, just because that would be extra effect that we don't want to layer on top. Other than that, keep everything else the same because you do want it to look the same. Maybe you get rid of the lens flare. But besides that, we're good with the camera options. So location, most of this shouldn't change. But for example, I might want to keep things similar as to where they are outside, because we're technically looking outside. So that's fine. I can leave that there. But for the weather, I might want to go ahead and make it a bit darker outside, because I do want to actually see more of what's inside. I don't want some of the exterior light that we're going to get to in just a second have more of an effect on what we're working with here. But if I do bring the weather to really dark and cloudy, I want to make sure I turn those effects off. Those particles need to be turned off, otherwise it's going to be raining, and that will look weird if we start to stack rain on top of a finished, clear day image. Also, if you have smog in the background, which I do, turn that off or bring it up, whichever. I will say a big part of this is experimenting, because a lot of times I might export something and realize, it looks good, or it doesn't look good, something like that. And so maybe smog 100% in my background looks great. I'm going to bring it all the way down for now. Okay, so we're done with weather. Let's now go into the lighting. We're going to spend basically the rest of the time here. And so global illumination, I basically want to come in here and probably max this out. There's not a ton that I can see happening here, and I want to probably bring this down to 150, whatever, smaller values to get those crisper shadows, crisper light. I also don't need this bouncing around 100 times. I don't need the global illumination to go beyond 100 feet. That's kind of the point here. And so even with this, I am going to turn global illumination off, and we'll get back to that. So let's turn it off, and you can see I am starting to see some really nice soft shadows under some of these objects. I can't say it's completely like I would want it to be, but under this sofa in particular looks quite grounded. We're looking for these objects to be grounded without a sun, basically. So if we come in here to the lighting settings, I do want my ambient all the way up, because I want the ambient shadows to be created. The other intensities don't necessarily matter so much, although the sun I do want to bring essentially all the way down. I don't want sun to impact this in any way. Don't worry, these reflections will get worked out with the render. So we're done with this. Go back to lighting. Again, my shadows, I would keep this consistent because you don't want to change the look of the shadows when we start to stack one on the other, so I will leave it right here where it is. And then finally the exposure. I have auto exposure turned off because I've fixed all of my lighting to be static without auto exposure on. And so now I'm just dealing with exposure. And so really what's all that is left is to play with this value and to get more of a basically knowing that the darker values are going to end up as shadows. That's kind of something to be aware of. And so it might be that we end up turning the glass back on because I don't want those dark values to end up being glass or to end up being shadows that are added to my scene, because I don't want that necessarily. I want to work with what's inside. And so, really get this exposure to a good value, but then now is when we're going to go back to that contrast. So go back to our camera, visual effects, color gradient, and then contrast. And now you can start to see really what some of this contrast is doing. I can't tell you there's a certain number. It's going to change depending on what you're trying to look at and what you're trying to focus on. But I will say I do like it probably somewhere around 60. And I think what I am going to do, at least for this first rendering, is go back to the clay edit, that clay render, and then turn glass on just so basically I'm isolating things within the scene here. And so everything white is going to go away, and I'll keep everything that is the shadow. This may not end up working well enough because of the effect that the global illumination will ultimately have, and what the exterior being glass, having glass there, what it will do. But as you can see, it really isn't doing anything to the inside, which is the point, particularly because I have global illumination off. So again, we'll get to that. So right now I'm going to leave this on, and then now I'm going to go back to my contrast, play with that a bit more, and then probably end up going back to my exposure, playing with that a bit more, and getting to the point where I'm happy with some of these shadow levels. So again, the thing to be aware of is that once we end up stacking this in Photoshop, we can really up the shadow values pretty easily in Photoshop, or decrease them pretty easily. And so what I want to do is get the right kind of levels all the way across, and by levels I mean consistency between the objects that we see in the scene. And so right now I'm seeing this looks a bit blown out here, and so I can bring the exposure down a little bit, and then maybe come back to my contrast and play with that some if I really want to. So you see what we need to do here. We can go back and forth as many times as we want, and we can honestly play with the contrast and all that a bit more within Photoshop also. And so I'm happy with this now. It looks pretty good. You can see under these sofas and even under these tables, I am getting a bit more ambient occlusion, especially up here. You could see some of these values, and I can't necessarily say that these were not there at all, and that magically I just made shadows. But what I am saying is that I'm going to isolate these, and I'm going to make them more apparent in my render, my final render, once I end up stacking these over the top of my finished rendering. Okay, so this looks good. I'm happy with this. And so what I have now is my two images. Cool. We have this, and we'll end up stacking this on top. And so what I actually want to do now is, again, I want to actually access the global illumination. And at this point, it might be a bit of an experiment based on the fact that I'm going to either need to turn my glass on or off for the clay. But we'll see it. What I want to do now, again, is delete the second one, come into my third one, and all I'm going to do is turn my global illumination on. And you can see that once, the dramatic effect that we have here, and that is simply because we now have light from the exterior coming in and impacting things. So that looks fantastic. But the last thing I want to do actually is make sure in both of these renders that I have all my lights turned off, because I don't want the lights to add extra lighting. I do want the shadows from the light to be there and impacted. So what I want to do is come in here and I have lights all the way here at the bottom of my scene, and I just want to make sure these are all off. And so there we go. And so now, just like before, we're going to have to go back and tweak some of these values. So I'm going to turn those off, hide them, and I just want to make sure that my exposure and values like that do look good. And so now we can really see where the ambient occlusion is now showing up, because I'm turning lights off. I'm really just accessing the shadows and some of the objects that some of the shadows that are created from these objects, of course. And so I do probably want a bit more exposure. And then finally, one more time, I'm sorry to say this one more time, but we're going to go back to the contrast. Bring the contrast up a bit more. Maybe I want to bring the exposure down a bit more. Again, this will always be up to you. And so really that looks pretty good. And so actually what I'm going to do now is delete this third one, or delete this second one, I'm sorry. Take this one here, end up duplicating this one. And so with this one, I already have the lights off. And then I just want to end up turning the global illumination off here. And so now what I end up having is my first image, well, now my third image now has the global illumination off with all these settings. You can see we have our extra shadows here, and then I have this other version which has global illumination on, and so we could see how the extra lighting from the global illumination is kind of softening everything, but it is actually adding some more and different shadows. So what I'm going to do now is end up exporting all three of these, taking them into Photoshop, and then stacking them. And so let me first export them, and we will be right back, and I will see you in Photoshop with all of them exported. So once I'm at the point where I have these two in, I probably just need to edit these a bit when it comes to adding curves to them. So I just want to make them pretty bright, not like overly bright, but again, we just need to know that every white value is going to go away, and we want to isolate some of the shadows more or less. And so getting rid of some of the darker areas is going to make it a bit easier when it comes to editing and allowing myself to actually deal with a not completely dark scene by adding so much shadow to my scene. I don't necessarily want to do that. And so something like this is where I'm really just isolating some of these shadows, and whenever I turn this to white, whenever I turn this to multiply and turn the whites off, I'm just left with the dark values, which is more of what I'm after. And so I'm going to do this exact same thing, adding some curve values, basically to lighten this up, so we just get some of those soft shadows that are left, because I do want to make sure that it's a little easier and that it's not really dark, actually darkening my final rendering. So once I have these ready to go into my main image, we just need to do that. We need to get them there. So the first thing I'll do is, because I don't like to be destructive, I'll copy all of these and just put them into a folder, turn that off, and I want to end up merging these two layers, the curves and this layer that we actually care about. So let's go ahead and merge those layers, and then I want to just duplicate this one into my main folder, or into my main image. We will do the same thing here. We'll duplicate these, put those into a folder, turn it off. Let's merge these two layers. And then I want to copy this into my main image. All right, so coming to my main image here, now we can see I've got these other layers, and we're not going to see the main image until we turn these, change the layer style to multiply, which is really what we care about. And so immediately we can see, you know, it's a bit darker because obviously we're taking those shadows, we're basically adding more shadows to the scene that, one, were already there, but two, adding some additional shadows that weren't there in the form of what we're calling, quote, ambient occlusion. And so you can see what happens whenever I turn these off, that yes, the scene gets brighter, but I end up getting some extra shadows in this case. So maybe I don't want these at 100%, maybe 50% is more like it. So really, once you get to the point where you're happy with the balance between the shadows and the brighter areas, really the full spectrum of basically the right contrast is what I'm trying to say. Once you're happy with that, you can make any further edits that you need to, but you know, overall I'm pretty happy with this. But again, because I don't like to be destructive, I do want to go ahead and duplicate these, put them into a folder, put that at the bottom, just go ahead and hide that, and I want to merge these together to make any further edits. And that's particularly because I like to use the camera raw filter, just because I'm very familiar with Lightroom and those settings, and really any further edits that you want to make here would apply to this final layer. And I am pretty happy with some of the shadows. Like you really can see some extra shadows underneath these tables. All that to say, I'm not fully happy with this, so there might be some small edits that I want to make here. Nothing too crazy. I do enjoy adding some vibrance and then bringing down the overall saturation of things. But really, this is, at this point, it is up to you, because it really does not matter. So I'm pretty happy with this. So I'll press OK here. And so we've got our main image. I'm very happy with this. And really, that is going to do it for this video. Essentially, what we've done is made our renderings in Twinmotion and then duplicated those, used the clay option, turned it into clay, and really added some extra contrast, pulled in the shadows, basically to where we're only showing shadows. And then at the end, we're bringing all of those into Photoshop and stacking them together, so we get extra shadows in a way, but not only extra shadows, but we can really boost the ambient occlusion to a degree. And so at the end of the day, I will say, and I should have prefaced this at the beginning of the video, that your results may vary. And while the original video I saw by SB Architect was fairly successful, it was not truly adding ambient occlusion like you would want. And just like here, you could see some of these objects still look like they're floating to a degree, and that's just because we don't have ambient occlusion working for us within Twinmotion. I hope that we do one day, but your results may vary, of course, and so I would recommend that you give this a try, but depending on the shot, you might have more or less results. You might have to add additional lights to introduce new shadows and do basically similar to what we just did, but to introduce new shadows in the hopes of those new shadows being some form of ambient occlusion that you could add and stack on later. So this is not necessarily a purely experimental video, because there is some backing behind it, but I would say that your results may vary, and it will not necessarily yield perfect results every time. And you're not going to necessarily get ambient occlusion like you want and like I want, but nonetheless, this is something better. So give this a shot. Let me know how it works in the comments. I definitely want to know if you had more or less luck than me, because to be honest, I think I was only minorly successful here. It's a good looking image, like good enough, but it's definitely not getting that ambient occlusion like I really, really wanted and hoped for, but that's fine. I will definitely get back to you as soon as we have true ambient occlusion or a real solution for that. But let me know how things work out for you in the meantime. So that will do it. If you did happen to learn something, which I hope you did, maybe you did, please demolish that like button. Helps me out a lot. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks so much for watching.